Hi, everybody, and welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, simultaneously with Richard Grannon Philosophy Channel. And this is the second of our textual healing series. I think Richard does that in a better voice than I do. So today
Textual healing.
There we go. The chocolatey tones of Richard Grannon. And you'll be glad to see, we started on time. B, touch wood. There have been no technical foul-ups yet. It's inevitable. I am involved. And I hope not to test Richard's patience of a saint.
Time to resolve that issue. If it's a lack of technical issues that we're struggling with, we can fuck it up somehow.
Right, so to get stuck in, I recommended this for Richard to read and for us to have a look at because I think it's an incredibly relevant and topical story, which we can get into. But I was just wondering, Richard, did you actually like it, and did you see any relevance to your work?
I definitely liked it. I saw huge relevance to narcissism, and there was a synchronicity to it in that I've been in Bucharest now for 2 weeks, and I'm I have to take a break after this because I'm a bit knackered. But I was like, when I come back, what am I going to focus on? And I thought, oh, well, we can get into narcissism and all the manifestations of the ways in which people are evil and why they're evil and all that. And I thought it's not terribly interesting to me, and I don't think it's very useful for people who are recovering from narcissistic abuse. But the notion that what is inside of the person who becomes the target of narcissistic abuse, in some Jungian sense, is an unresolved shadow or something like that. It was already on my mind, and then you see in this story clear what Jung would have called shadow possession. A guy becomes possessed by his own obsession with darkness itself. And there are some beautiful lines from this story. But the first quote that I dug out was from Carl Jung, and it was, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And I think this story on some level could be interpreted as a man who attempts to make the darkness conscious and ultimately fails with tragic consequences.
Yeah, and given that it was some 1816, it was published. It's interesting because I was reading, I'm going to do a pile of videos on this, but I was reading Freud's essay, The Uncanny, and he cites, as does a guy, I did a video on a guy called Ernst Jentz, who did an essay called On the Psychology of the Uncanny that, again, Freud cited. And he did it about, I think he published that 1906, and Freud's essay on the Uncanny was 1919. So these are some of the links, but he basically wrote this story approximately 100 years earlier. Yeah. And you could see why Freud was interested in it. It was made for him. But interestingly, the more I've looked into the Freud essay, there's been quite a few literary scholars have said Freud has basically misunderstood it or read it in a typically Freudian way, when actually you could argue the essay is a lot more complicated than that. But for sure, I could see, because I know a lot less than you do about Jung, I know a bit more about Freud. I could definitely see the shadow stuff because the word darkness is mentioned. And I was going to, if you remind me later, if we don't talk about it, the concept of fire. It's fire and darkness and empty eye sockets. And I loved, there's all of this, so that gives it a gothic tone. But one of the things I actually liked is it's melodramatic and it's quite dated in its writing. It's all about, it doesn't exactly say forsooth, but people are swooning left, right, and center. And there's quite, they disagree and have a duel. So there's daft things go on that are quite melodramatic. But I actually like that because it put into contrast, it acted as a foil for the accuracy of some of the psychological insights. So you're being swept up in this like hammy narrative, but actually when it punches you with a psychological insight that's really acute, that almost doubled the effect because you're not expecting it.
Yes, and that means at a meta level, the story itself is uncanny because it's uncannily modern. When you get to the end of it, you're thinking, did he really write this in 1816? I mean, it's uncanny just how effectively he predicts the obsession with machine, obsession with that which seems to be human but is not, which is how you could very easily define a narcissistically abusive relationship. It's becoming obsessed with something that looks like a human, but inside is a clockwork person.
Yeah, before I forget, because this is such a constant, I'm a bit tired today, so my memory has gone. But the concept of narcissism, what Freud picks up on is the idea of, I think he calls it dissociated complexes or dissociative complex. And he says that he sees, it's what I mentioned about the circle. Nathaniel goes round in these mental circles, and the way he relates to Olympia, the automaton, is basically a projection of his own feelings onto her, and then he sees what he wants to see. So there's a narcissistic relationship with Olympia straight away.
Yes, and I think just to address the Freud point, I actually found Freud's essay as well a bit superficial and a bit rigidly Freudian. He's like, oh, they want to steal the children's eyes. That's castration fear. And then the man keeps the eyes. That's the fear that the father's going to chop your balls off and keep them in the bag. And I was like, Sigmund, I think you're off on that one. I didn't get that. And I think if,
but sorry to interrupt you, because I wanted to ask you to go into that a bit more.
Yeah.
Can you correct me if I've misunderstood? But my understanding of the castration complex is you can go, yes, it has the literal connotation of having your todger chopped off. And the idea is that children see, that a male child sees at a very early age, if he gets to see a female's private parts, there's something missing. But my understanding also was there's a more nuanced layer whereby it represents the loss of self, because the child realizes that they're not the same as somebody else. They also, this idea of castration being taken out by the father to the child, there's issues of authority, but it all relates to the idea of losing a sense of yourself. So you're being castrated in that more metaphorical sense. Yeah, or is that?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think Freud is the worst elements of Freud is when it's taken literally. It's only useful ever metaphorically. The fear that the father and society and culture and church will hobble me, will stop me from growing. Yes, I think that's real. The literal fear of castration, which Freud really literally believed children had, I think was a projection from Freud himself. I mean, Freud came to most of his conclusions through introspection and cocaine. So some of his ideas are a bit odd. But that one, yes, I mean, a child's fear that the masculine authority figure could crush me. And maybe they even sense on some level that there are adult males in their lives who do want to crush them, who do have the desire to hurt them just because they can, out of just pure brute sadism. So castration fear, yes, if we mean that, sure.
Yeah, and there's also, I was thinking in terms of narcissism, because I've done videos on the original Narcissus myth and the concept of doubling, seeing your own reflection. And all the way through the story, I've already mentioned that Nathaniel imputes responses from Olympia, but also there's lots of doubling. So, which is another form of reflection. So if Narcissus is looking at his own reflection on my channel, people are fed up with the constant use of Caravaggio's painting, which you've seen me use endless amounts of time. I'm absolutely obsessed by it, which tells you something about my mental state.
Narcissistically.
But this projection onto Olympia, but then when you actually look, Clara, the way he describes her is borderline vacuous. And one of the reasons he likes her is he can project anything he wants onto her.
Well, I think the story makes clear that Nathaniel is not well. The concept of being traumatized in childhood wouldn't have existed as an explicit idea at the time of writing. But the author clearly feels that way. Nathaniel is not well to begin with. And he is a superficial man, unfortunately, who's easily beguiled by superficial things. He's very much about looks and appearance and newness, new modern machinery, tricks and looking glasses, and the way a woman's posture is. He describes mathematically that she doesn't have a beautiful face, but the proportions of her head and neck and bosom are described as he himself is a bit of a robotic automaton as well. And yes, you're right, his description of Clara is robot-like.
Actually, I don't want to reveal too much of myself, so can I adopt an alter ego for the purpose?
So just say your mate said it. That's what I do. My mate said.
Because that fools everybody. But yeah. I actually wasn't thinking. I'm more sympathetic to Nathaniel, because I'd interpreted more. I do understand in the tale there are a couple of references to the fact he is good at science, or he enjoys science. Maybe I've been swung too much by reading too many essays that see Nathaniel as an emblem of, the romantic poets movement and the romantic writers movement, because I don't want to bore viewers senseless with, at the time, 1816. If you think about it, the French Revolution was 1879. Not long happened. During that period, Kant was writing about the critique of judgment, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of pure reason. And there was a massive debate in society. Do you build society on pure reason like they tried in the French Revolution? Or the romantic poets and writers were all about, you need to get in touch with your imagination. Reason without imagination leads to the terror. In a different sense, the terror of the French Revolution. So in that sense, Nathaniel is a representative of, he goes mad because he's trying at least to keep in touch with what you called his shadow. But that's the realm of the imagination that was trying to be, arguably, Prussia at the time where Hoffmann's writing was the beginnings of state bureaucracy. It was the beginnings of the modern machine that I've been looking at recently with reference to Paul Kingsnorth's work Against the Machine. That this time of the world in the West, the Western Enlightenment, was the precursor for all the terrible automated aspects of our lives now.
Well, I read that, placing it back again in history with similarly, as I read the character from the Brothers Karamazov, which is 1885, I think, or sequentially, it was eventually finished in 1885. There was one of the brothers, I can't, is it not Alyosha? He was the good one. I can't remember which brother, but he was like Nathaniel. He would become obsessed, and he was very emotionally dysregulated. And Dostoevsky is offering a gentle critique, I think, of that type of person. And the guy basically drives himself mad because he falls in love narcissistically with things, with women. And then she's the best woman in the world and he has to have her. I read Hoffmann's portrayal of Nathaniel as a little bit of a critique of a genre of person that existed in that time. I didn't know about the romantic writers, but I got the sense of, here is a man who's seen a group of men acting in a certain way, and he's worried that they're prone to to see things that are not there, and to become darkly obsessed with things that are not there, and to quite frankly destroy themselves in it. I read it as quite critical of Nathaniel.
But there are books like the Tales of Young Werther, which are all about the tragic nobility of doing exactly what you're describing. So this was part of the romantic, basically starving yourself to death or wasting away, which again, ironically, is what Narcissus does. But I understand from a rational point of view, it makes no sense. But this was a reaction in a literary sense to what they were sensing was this increasing encroachment of uber rationalization, too much rationalization, the death of the imagination. There's no room now. And in both Freud and Jens's essays about the uncanny, they keep talking about savages or primitive people and children. They're the ones that are in touch with the supernatural. But in more so-called sophisticated Western culture, we've moved beyond that. And what the uncanny is, to some extent, is a reminder to people who've suppressed what children and more primitive societies are more in touch with. We've repressed it, but it reappears as the uncanny. So in that, I'd argue in that context, one of my criticisms of both Jens and Freud, because I think I'll criticize them today. Who am I? But I'll have a go.
They're dead. Fuck them. What are they going to do?
I think they underplay this. I think, and you'll know much more about this than me, but the Freudian thing about basically everything's driven by subterranean drives, our libido, etc. And Freud was arguing that you need to repress that civilization and its discontent. You need to repress that so society can function. And the role of a therapist, to some extent, is to siphon off the excess repression, to talk it through, to basically drain the swamp, in a sense, so that you can function in a civilized society. You know, that's what the talking cure is all about, isn't it?
Yes, but I would just add to that, as far as I've understood it in the German tradition, there's an acceptance that, yes, we must repress our animal drives, but Germans are pretty consistent in their warnings of what will happen if you do that. There's usually an implication that there will be an explosion. And I think that was what Nietzsche's point was about Dionysus and Apollo. If there's too much Apollo, not enough Dionysus, there's going to be an explosion. But of course, if we become fully Dionysian and we become primitive, we'll start accidentally killing each. I mean, you lose civilization. Then you will start to regress civilizationally. This is the same group of people, the German neurologists and psychologists of the time, who invented the vibrator because of the fear of sexual repression. And I only found this out a couple of days ago. Did you know this, that the doctors who originally started using orgasms as a method of dealing with female hysteria...
Was it Reich? Was it Reich, his name was, I think?
He wasn't the first one, but I'm always thinking of Reich. I love Reich's model of the machine, that it's switched, it ignites, it becomes excited, it's aroused, then there's the consummation of the thing itself, then there's an orgasmic explosion, then there's the little death, then it reawakens and goes back through the cycle again. That's the Reichian cycle. But I didn't know these original repressed gentlemen of Vienna, they were actually doing skin-to-skin contact with their female clients, because they were doctors. And if the doctor said, drop your drawers, you dropped your drawers. I didn't know that. I thought they sat them in their petticoats atop a sort of a machine that would gently rock them. I didn't know they were literally with their hands masturbating them. And then they would get repetitive strain injury that caused the they would this is becoming like the jolly heretic, I'm so sorry. They were doing it so often. Well, they said, we must find a machine. My arm is tired.
Psychiatrist's elbow.
Yes, exactly. I didn't know. I didn't know they were literally physically doing skin on skin. I had no idea. I was so naive. I was like, oh no, they probably just had them sit on the edge of a couch, and maybe they held them by the shoulders and rocked them backwards and forwards or something. No, they went in there and they got on with it. All that to say that, you know, you remind me that I have an interjected Paul Taylor. Everyone should have an interjected Paul Taylor. You're there in my mind. You often remind me it's very hard for us to know how people actually really thought and felt at any given moment in time. The episteme or the episteme, I never remember how to say it. Episteme. We can't really access that. So I would have said, absolutely not in those times. It would have been a scandal if a doctor had masturbated one of his patients to orgasm. No, it was considered perfectly natural, perfectly. And I'm thinking, okay, so when we look at these period pieces, and I think even Freud made this mistake, looking back 103 years later, we're not actually really able to penetrate the coordinates in which everything that is happening. We think we know how sexually repressed it was, but if you just say the sentence, it was sexually repressed, you don't know to a nicety and a nuance exactly what all the little rules you must and must not really were in those times.
That's one of the, I find that highly relevant to today, because if you want to talk about it later, it just struck me as I was reading through, there was the concept of looking through lenses all the time, and the way he looked at her, and the notion of reflections. At various points, I thought were parallels to the modern porn affliction. the way in which men objectify women and are looking through lenses, and they project on to these automaton figures. It struck me as highly relevant.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. That's actually really good. And the trigger that finally does Nathaniel in is he's trying to look far away, but he accidentally points it at Clara.
Clara gets before the lens.
She gets before that, and he sees a huge version of her in a circle. And then he starts doing this. It's very arcane language. Ho, 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 the circle burns. The circle is afire again. Grabs her, shouting, ho, 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 the circle. Here you are. You've come to kill me. Tries to kill her. But I didn't think of it in the porn addiction age. Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Well, there's also, I came across an epigraph. I'm not quite sure it came from, but Hoffmann himself, the author, wrote about how he referred to his plural egos as if through lenses. So that's why there's a mention of lenses all the way through, and the notion of eyes. But if you think of eyes, is obviously a Gothic theme that runs throughout eyes and vision. But the number of times there's artificial eyes, and Capello is he brings the lorgnettes and the eyeglasses into the room, doesn't he? And starts to almost to scare him with them. And then he buys a spyglass, and it's through the lens of the spyglass that he looks at Olympia, this semi-pornographic automaton. But I just found it fascinating, this concept of your fractured ego being linked to the emergence of lenses everywhere. Again, in a modern context where everyone sees their own reflection in social media, this is the Hoffmann story on steroids.
Yes, it is. I suppose it's the Hoffmann story inverted. I mean, in that sense, we're now in the panopticon, where Olympia being watched by a million faceless Nathaniels. You could, if you wanted to explode the concept out to that level. Another criticism of Nathaniel, just while it's in my mind, I don't think Freud really gives us great insight here. Jung obviously didn't write about it, but the Jungian tradition offers us more insight. There is a Jungian psychotherapist after Jung. Her name is Marie-Louise von Franz. I couldn't find the quote, but I can find it on YouTube if people are interested. She talks about men who become anima possessed, which essentially means the spirited female side of their nature. They've repressed it, and then it comes back and possesses them. That which is repressed comes back to possessed. And she has a very, very strong accent. And she says, the man who's anima possessed, he stands outside the woman's window, howling like a cat in heat. And she's saying the guy who's become obsessed with his own image of a woman, it's a narcissistic endeavor. It's nothing to do with her, but my desire is just driving me to howl outside of her window like a cat in heat, just repeatedly and obsessively. But it's not coming from her. It's not coming from Olympia. Olympia is a robot. It's all coming from Nathaniel. And I thought that I think offers us a bit more insight into where I think Hoffmann is going than Freud's analysis. So I'm pasting a post hoc Jungian view onto this and saying it probably is more in line with Hoffmann's intent than the way Freud read it.
Well, to defend old Siggy, as I like to call him, he does fixate on the notion of the drives and this idea I mentioned earlier, dissociative complexes. The circularity of the libido, the death drive, the things that we do that are actually self-sabotaging, but we choose to do them anyway. Because I remember reading Gregory Bateson on a different angle when he was talking about addiction. And he's making the point that in the midst of for example, with an alcoholic, they can arbitrarily start maybe cutting down a little bit, knowing full well the next day they're going to overdo it, because it's being in control of the process. Whereas trying to give up completely, they lose all control. So even in the depths of their alcoholism, they can take those various strategies that give them a sense of control. So
Yes.
I'm fascinated by the Freudian notion of the drives and the circularity. And I can see why Jung, in terms of the shadow stuff, maybe arguably makes even more sense. But this, what I'm interested in, it's Freud's failed reading, often failed readings of a story actually create an interesting dynamic. So I think Freud's uncanny essay, for Freud's standard, isn't one of his best. But I think you identified it earlier. It's also uncanny for the way he misses the point. And he tries to superimpose his own interpretation on the story and fails to realize that the story itself is about interpretation and the way in
Yes.
which interpretation will always fail, because that's the nature of the beast. And what people do to compensate is like Nathaniel, they superimpose their rigid libidinal drives rather than embrace complexity, embrace subtlety and nuance. And that's why I'm really an admirer of the story itself, because I think in some ways it's a defense of the importance of literature. You compare that story and what, if you're perceptive and you're prepared to engage with the nuance. And I've heard you in the past contrast that with what you've mentioned in the past about DSM-5. For viewers who aren't aware of it, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in the States, isn't it? And they list categories of symptoms in order to, inverted commas, define a condition. When if you truly wanted to understand the type of dissociative complexes and circular drives that go on in human relationships, that essay by Hoffmann, that story, I'd suggest is much more psychologically insightful than reading a list of symptoms.
100% it is. And you can go further with the criticism of the DSM. You can say, like Nathaniel, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual definition of narcissism is ironically and uncannily narcissistic, because the intent has nothing to do with healing. We know it, but we don't know it. As Zizek's fetishist split, we know it, but we don't know it. Psychiatry is for healing broken minds. Well, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, strictly speaking, is to ascertain what insurance bracket you go into in America, because there's no National Health Service. That's what it's used for. And they need 9 traits that are an equally weighted shopping list of irritating behaviors that we can observe. I can't think of a more rigid or narcissistic way of defining somebody else's inner life. They're not interested in their inner life. Like, okay, bring the client in. Is he doing 5 of the 9? Yes. Okay, he goes in insurance band B or whatever it is. Get him out. Nothing to do with healing. In the same way, Nathaniel's love isn't the so I found Nathaniel's love horrifying. I really found him horrifying as a character. Nathaniel's love is not about love. Nathaniel's love is about him and his desire to possess and his desire to control. And it's fueled with, I think he becomes the monster in the end. I think he is a little boy frightened by Coppola, or however they changed the name. It's Coppola-esque or something.
Is it Coppelius? Sorry, I should know this. Yeah.
Coppelius. So the name changes slightly during the course of the book, because Nathaniel starts seeing an external reality, which is a Jungian point I want to come back to in a second. He starts seeing an external reality, that which is in his internal reality. And he goes, synchronicity, confirmation. My original abuser was Coppelius, and this optometrist is Coppola. They're the same person. And then somebody has to come along and break his delusion and go, dude, the age is wrong. That guy's from, I don't know, I think he's from Italy, and that guy's from Germany. And we know people in Italy who know, calm down. And he goes, oh, sorry. Yes, you're right. It's not him. I think he becomes that thing that he fears so much in the end. He becomes
But in defense of Nathaniel, though, Nathaniel, I'd argue that he might be wrong in the specifics, but he's right in the actuality. That there are, I don't want to use the word supernatural, but there are drives, or there are certain recognizable behaviors in people. It could be someone you meet 20 years later that replicate the same demonic drive that you experienced 20 years previously. So in that psychological sense, it can be quite accurate.
Oh, you're talking to the narcissistic abuse crowd directly now. They'll love that.
Exactly. That's why I suggested this story, because I could just see both the victim and the perpetrators, this repetitive cycles that go on
Yes.
and that you
Yes.
recognize, but still you can't escape. I could
Yes.
just see so many parallels.
The second quote from Jung I wanted to cite from Psychological Aspects of the Personality says, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. So Jung was big on this, that it's that which is within us. If it's not resolved, it's going to show up externally. And Jung was a mystic. I mean, he believed in synchronicities. He would say, by means that are possibly beyond Western mechanistic science, we attract or co-create, or we do have these situations that come again. It is a strange coincidence that Coppelius, it's not a common name, I wouldn't have thought. A similar character shows up whose name is Coppola, and this poor fevered guy who's not, I think from the story it's evident he's not well, starts thinking that's the same person, and he even has the same name.
Yeah, and just before we get, Coppo, I think, means eye socket, and Coppella means it's like the crucible you use in alchemy, which is directly relevant to obviously what happens in the story.
Wow.
But the eye socket, and even it's the beautiful way in which he uses imagery. When Nathaniel is talking to Olympia and everyone's left, and that's a brilliant example of his obsession. Everyone's been laughing at Olympia for acting like clockwork. And even he says the face of her father, inverted commas, her father, becomes darker just because the lights are getting darker. But he mentions the candle sockets. He actually says the candle sockets become empty. So you've got this idea of these two empty candle sockets, empty eye sockets are mentioned all the time. And I just thought that was brilliantly done. There is something, when eyes are mentioned in the story, they're emotionless. So they're empty metaphorically, but also there are literal empty sockets, which I don't know about you, I think freak out most people. When you see a mask without active eyes, there is something uncanny about it. And then I go on about this all the time. Eyes themselves, these little gelatinous orbs. One look of someone who knows you very well is more expressive than thousands of pages of literature. And all it is this weird jelly-like organ. I just find that truly bizarre, that you can look like, I'm getting the sense you're incredibly bored and hate me. I can see that in your eyes, but you don't have to put that into words. That's quite an amazing thing, isn't it?
It is remarkable that you can see so much. I mean, hate is strong. Contempt, I think, was what I was. But we can work on your perception of negative emotion. It is interesting, and what you said about the candles offering light and then becoming empty sockets, it reminded me that the ancient Egyptians apparently believed when we saw, we weren't receiving light. We were sending out an energy from the eyes, had an energy in them that would reach forward like fire, like
the
a candle.
Greeks as well. The Greeks had various ideas on that, yeah.
Right.
And even in
right,
Mediterranean society, in Mediterranean society today, the idea, especially, we've both got blue eyes, I think.
Yes.
Blue eyes are the evil eye. You can get amulets in Greece and Turkey to this day.
Yes.
So the evil eye is a real thing.
That then it made me. I can't penetrate Lacan. How very Freudian of me. I really struggle with it. But I went back to his concept of the gaze, and it's another element of this story from the psychoanalytic tradition that I think helps us to understand. There's a lot of our self-concept is drawn from the awareness as we travel through childhood to adolescence that people are looking at us. They're watching us. Olympia is being fawned over by Nathaniel, but the general society is watching her and they're having a completely different experience. The big synchronicity there is just 7 days earlier, For me, I was saying, oh, I need to start reminding the victims of narcissistic abuse that when they've become obsessed with a person, in objective reality, other people that could see through that person. They could see that that wasn't a nice person. They could see that they were aggressive or bullying or unpleasant or confrontational, but we couldn't. So that brings the locus of control back to me. What is it that caused me to see Olympia as just the essence of womanhood and beautiful and amazing, and everybody else who was there just thought she was a bit of a joke?
Yeah, this is constantly throughout the story as well. There's this internal, external dichotomy, and I think that was the extra. His friend, is it Sigamundi or whatever? I've forgotten his name. But at various points, there are an inverted commas objective perspective. So the narrator, for example, it's interesting. The whole story begins with 3 letters. And
Yes.
then the narrator intervenes and says, I would have liked to have expressed myself right from the beginning. I think he says, I could have started in media res, in other words, in Latin, in the middle of things, but I couldn't find a way to do it. So instead, I provided you with these 3 letters, which provide some type of objective distance as a record of what people were thinking. But that, if you think about it, is Hoffmann playing a game as the writer. He's hiding behind the persona of a narrator who's hiding behind the idea that he provided 3 imaginary letters, which are helping to push the story. And then you've got, then you've got the narrator as he himself adopts some of the characteristics of Nathaniel by saying, have you ever tried to express yourself and you feel this fire burning within you and the images are so clear, but you can't express it to other people and they wonder what you're talking about? I just found it interesting that the narrator is basically emoting some of the same feelings that Nathaniel embodies in the story. And that's what made me argue that the whole story is about the act of interpretation, the act of writing. And it's to your point, other people on the outside see inverted commas more objectively, but they're also interpreting. And then what you've got in today's society is, I totally accept in this particular case, the people observing his obsession with Olympia are more objective, and it is a bit ridiculous. But we've almost overcompensated in contemporary times because those external viewers of our personal relationships have become almost the judge and jury because we're too dependent upon the herd now. The type of independent, albeit obsessive behavior of Nathaniel is at least authentically him, even if it's demonically demented. But we've given ourselves over to the demonism of the herd. The people looking from the outside, the fact that the whole, I can't get out my little analysis all the time, is that the social media creates these purportedly neutral observers, but you all enter the cycle.
Yes, and I agree with you that social media, well, mainstream media as well, it's not a neutral space. It is a space of judgment, and it is a space of retribution. I'm going to write a short story, and I did it because your introject told me to, about stoning someone to death. It's going to be graphic and gory, but I want to try and enter the subjective space of a man who pays in a fake state that doesn't exist to be frontline at a stoning, just so he can stone someone to death. And this is because you got me onto Girard, isn't it, with the scapegoating concept? And I really, really think we need, we need to go much deeper into that drive in people, which is that in this, as you said, the toxic herd, once they've herded around a spectacle, a singular spectacle, your favorite celebrity, your favorite social media influencer, or whatever, there's a very strong desire there to tear them to shreds. As much as you love them consciously, but your unconscious despises them and loathes them because
and knows they will eventually fall.
And is waiting with sharpened blades and sharpened stones to join in the stoning and to get the
and it's
sexual
also,
the release of the stoning.
in terms of an emotional investment as well, paradoxically, it makes sense. The more you invest in them by admiring them, the more perverse enjoyment you get when they fall. The two things are related. So
Yes, 100%.
it may seem contradictory. Why would you glorify the person that you adored? But actually, cathectically, they're linked, aren't they?
100%. 100%. The more you love them, the more libidinous pleasure, rigid libidinous, and narcissistic pleasure you can take in their downfall. And then you get to beat your own chest and say, they failed me. I thought they were this, but lo, they had feet of clay and turned out not to be a god. Where is your God now? They scream as they hurl the stones and smash your brains to pieces.
While it's fresh in my mind. Sorry, while it's fresh in my mind, our mate Darren. What's Darren's surname? I've forgotten momentarily. Northern
McGee.
Irish Darren McGee. Sorry,
McGee.
Yeah, Darren's when he read out on one of the programs we did, this need to be heard rather than I just need to speak. And basically, I don't need a conversation. I don't need true dialogue. I just want you to listen to me. And I had quite a knee-jerk react. Part of it was to be provocative to keep the conversation going. But part of it was quite a visceral response that I quite profoundly disagree with that mentality. But it's in this story that basically he loves Clara because normally she listens to him and doesn't really pay attention. And he can read her stories and she just sews and it doesn't bother her in the slightest. And it's only when he becomes a bit obsessive and talks about the darkness that she shows a lack of sympathy. And Olympia is the absolute goddess, so to speak, because he can tell her anything. And she just goes, like a robot. And that struck me as contemporary, having a contemporary relevance, because that seems to be what people need, inner listeners. And it's one of the arguments I'd have as to why we've entered a realm where true dialogue in political terms, ideologies have become entrenched. People aren't dialoguing at all. It's you listen to my hurt or my speech, and maybe you'll get the chance to give that hurt speech to someone else. The listening is passive, like Olympia. And I find that quite concerning, but I could see it in the story and I could see the contemporary relevance.
Let's put Freud back on his pedestal, because I wouldn't be able to say what I'm about to say without him. There is in some types of love, and I would argue it's very, very common in the modern consumer capitalist dating scene, which is purely masturbational. And I'm not being gratuitous saying that. I mean, it's literally solipsistic, it's narcissistic, has nothing to do with another person. It only has to do with the other person coming in as the perfect embodiment of your pre-existing, so dead fantasy. There's nothing spontaneous about it. It's from the past being projected onto a living person in the future. And to the thing of being a passive listener, you're preaching to the choir with me, because one of the reasons why I gave up coaching was because I would have said 80 to 90% of my clients would have been perfectly happy paying me. And when I finished coaching, I wasn't cheap, to just sit and listen to them for an hour and nod and smile. And they would actually become quite irritated when I would interrupt them, when I would challenge them, when I would say, what are our objectives here? And what is it you would like to get done? What are you mainly struggling with today? We're here to resolve problems and to move forward. And they'd get quite irritated and they get quite sort of pissy with me. And they didn't enjoy that as much. They would quite happily just fill the 55-minute slot that they had booked with them just talking and me just sitting and listening. And I started to jokingly say, I'm not your psychological dildo. I'm not here to be dildoed. You talk to the fucking cat. Like, what's the point of me even fucking being here?
Is it the dildoer and the dildeer?
I would say the dildoer and the dildee. Yes. And I was very much the dildee. No, they're the dildee and I'm the dildo. So I didn't. I personally don't like that. I don't believe in its I don't believe in its benefits. Just listen to me. Well, but sorry, I'll end. I've talked for too long. There is now new research recently published that says it's actually very bad for people. So if people are just saying, this is the terrible thing that happened to me, all you're doing is raising your cortisol levels and making yourself addicted and trained to want to do it more. It's a terrible habit to adopt.
I can't remember whether we've spoken about this before, but do you remember, if you've ever watched The Sopranos, there's a beautiful moment when this old Jewish therapist tells Carmela Soprano exactly what her problem is. I'll send you the link of the segment on YouTube. You need to watch it. It's absolutely hilarious, because basically she wants to tell him that she's living in this terrible double bind and her husband's a gangster, but she loves her children. She doesn't want to leave him. And in 5 minutes, he just says, I want to start off by telling you I'm not going to take your money. And she says, well, that's a new one, being quite sarcastic. And he goes, no, you're living off blood money. That fur coat you've got is blood money. People have died for that. He said, if you have any self-respect, get your kids, get just the basic clothes in a suitcase and leave him now. And if you don't, you're a liar to yourself, blah, blah, blah. And he just goes on a tear. And it's just like, of all the times a therapist has sat there and gone, like Olympia, this is the one time in a 5-minute, very well-written spiel, this old, very wise psychiatrist or psychoanalyst basically says, you want indulgence, I'm not giving it you. And in the actual Sopranos, she has a platonic relationship with a flirty priest, Catholic priest.
I was gonna say,
and he's the alter ego.
Keeps feeding him.
But he's feeding her by condoning her situation, by saying, oh, God forgives everybody. And this old analyst is saying, no, bugger that.
No,
you're with an evil man. Face up to it. And that reminded me of the beginning of the story in a weird way, because if you remember the beginning of the story, he asks his mother, what is the Sandman? And she says, oh, it's when you're tired. It's this man who throws sand and he makes your eyes close and you drift off to sleep. And then he asks the old woman. And I've used it at the beginning of a video. I just do the two, what the mother says and then what the old nursemaid says. And it's, oh, Nate, it's this guy who rips out your eyes and feeds them to his children who live like little birds on the moon.
On the crescent moon. I listened to your video today. It was very good. It was very, very good.
Well, but that again encapsulates for me what the youth, that was my PTSD of being in the university system. I wanted to be the old nursemaid telling the truth. And the hierarchy and the whole university system now is the mother not letting them deal with the darkness. And that's why I'm a bit more sympathetic to Nathaniel perhaps than you are, because I saw him at least, and this is what I was saying about his relationship to the wider romantic movement in poetry and literature. He's a representative of, deluded and demented as he is, this is what this is what being truly independent is. It's fighting your shadows. It's being prepared to go there.
Yes. Interestingly, I did another interview earlier today, and we were talking about the psychotherapeutic relationship. And the person interviewing me has had fairly weak and not helpful experiences with psychotherapists. And I was trying to explain to her, look, all this stuff about compassion and acceptance and letting go, sometimes that's for the psychotherapist. It's not really for you as the client. You're making the psychotherapist feel uncomfortable. And when they can go back to they're calm, gentle, and everything is okay, it's very weak and it's very lazy. And I think it's neurotic. It's there are male psychotherapists and female psychotherapists that do this, but it's anima possession. You just turn into a smother mother. Everything that is a problem, you just squish against your bosom and say, there, don't think about it anymore. Whereas sometimes what is needed is, yes, the old vicious crone in the story who tells the little boy that his eyes are going to be fed to the children who live on the crescent moon. I agree with you, and it is a problem, because that psychotherapeutic ideology of there, calm down, nurture, it's leaked across culture. Like, our culture is just riddled. It's infected with this perverted psychologization.
Before I forget, the shadow thing you were talking about, Jung's idea, the shadow. Did you notice at the very end when they climb up the tower, it was noon? And he specifically mentions, are you aware of the significance of noon? Because Nietzsche talks about it. It's when the shadow...
the undergang.
Yeah, well, it's when the shadow is closest to your body.
Mm-hmm.
And so the difference in you and your double, you and your shadow, is at its minimum at noon. And that's almost when time stops. There isn't this difference between you and your past or you and your future. Noon is this like semi-mythical time when temporally and spatially everything comes together because the shadow is partially joined to your body. It's not as separated because the sun is directly overhead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's when they go up the tower.
Okay, I'm going to blame my my brain damage here. I understood noon when I read the book, and when you just said it now as sundown. For those of you watching at home, noon is not sundown. Noon is the zenith of the sun in the sky when it's right overhead of you. Don't be stupid like Richard. Be smart like Dr. Paul Taylor and know what the fuck noon is.
But isn't that fascinating? The level of detail, the psychological accuracy of what he's talking about.
Yes, yes, and that they were in the tower above everything else. There was isolation. There was nobody to gaze at them there. They were not seen there. I think it's brilliant, but I hadn't caught the fact that it was noon and that it was a shadowless time. I thought it was the end of the day, and we were going into Nietzsche's downgoing period. No, okay, it's noon, so there's no shadow there. Or you're actually, your shadow is perfectly aligned with you. Yes, very interesting.
And then the other thing I'm thinking about, you mentioned Lacan earlier. Lacan had this phrase that the letter always arrives at its destination, and I think what he meant by that was, even if a letter physically doesn't arrive where it was meant to be sent, it always arrives at its destination in the sense that you wrote it and it's had its effect. It's hard to explain, but it's just interesting. At the beginning of the story, the letter was written mistakenly. It was supposed to be written to Lafleur, the brother of Clara, but he mistakenly, because he was stressed, sent it to Clara. But it's this idea, the letter always arrives at its destination. The real person who should have received it in the first place was Clara, and she does get the letter.
Yes, and seems to offer him some pretty good advice when she writes back to him. Clara seems to have the clarity in the story.
This is where I think we've disagreed on this one, because I think if you read that section where she mentioned it, quite funny. She skates over. She says, "Oh, thanks for your letter. I realized immediately I realized it was meant for my brother, and I should have passed it on to him, but I didn't. Sorry about that." And then she goes into this explanation of what she thinks the letter's about, with basically immediately excusing herself for a complete betrayal of privacy. I think she's got a side to her, Clara, that you're letting her off the hook.
I totally left her off the hook just because the analysis was good. She's writing back to Nathaniel, who has mistakenly addressed her in a letter that's meant for Lothair, her brother, and she says, "You are taking for real the workings of your own dark imagination, and you are yourself the maker of the ghost that terrifies you. The Sandman is nothing more than a dreadful creation of your own mind. You must tear yourself away from these phantoms, otherwise they will drive you to madness." She's doing good psychoanalytic work there.
Except, what if the opposite is true?
What if?
Because my problem with that is she is the foil. She's set up to be this common, and the irony is in all of this that normally I would be on Clara's side. I'm the first person to say, grow up, shut up, I don't want to hear you whinging, deal with it. But the other schizophrenic side of me says, this is the repression. If you don't engage with the underlying drives that are creating the issue, if you're not sensitive to the fact there is a beyond the scientific, whether you call it the supernatural or underlying emotional reality that is unique to you as an individual, but then gets filtered through society, there isn't this DSM-5 answer to life. And she's verging on that type of, yes, it's commonsensical, etc. But what if, to be fair to Nathaniel, he's had this genuine trauma when he was young? And the point, I thought, what was one of the really powerful aspects of the story is it's the formative power of an early trauma, which seems to me psychologically very, very true. It's not much help, and I am the least sympathetic person on earth. You can testify to this, but I'd suggest it's not that helpful for someone to say, grow a pair.
Well, you're quite right, but she is his girlfriend. I mean, she's not actually his therapist. There's something else she says that I liked. When you say that there is a mysterious power which lays hold of you and rules your life, you only make it harder to resist the delusion. Everything depends upon your own will, Nathaniel. Banish these morbid thoughts, and the phantom will vanish. Yes, it's not trauma informed, as we would say nowadays. That's not how you talk to a traumatized person. But then, what does he really need? Where should he be going? Who should he be talking to in this story?
Well, I think what I'm clumsily trying to point out is, rather than people like Jens and Freud suggest that it's only children or primitive people who are more in touch with not the anima, but the animistic, the idea that inanimate objects have a life of their own, that they're referring to that constantly as a primitive way of thinking. But actually, I always go back with you to the concept of Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. Greek theatre was a cathartic vehicle for processing raw emotion. Rituals in Greek society and Roman society were absolutely everywhere. And we live in this hyper-rational society now that doesn't have those vehicles for catharsis. So Clara's advice is fine if you're in a healthy society that has alternative modes of processing raw emotion.
Yes. I go on.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov, again, which we're going to cover next month, I believe. It's obvious. I mean, Dostoevsky makes this pained case for the mysticism of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And he says, I know full well some of these monks you go to visit are con artists and liars and showmen. And yet we still need them. Because I don't know how it worked in Russia. The babushkas would go up with offerings and jam and bread and give it to the monk. And he would do an incantation and remove a demon, which he could see. And one of these particularly egregious con artists pretended he'd slammed the tail of a demon in a door. And he was saying, do you see, I've caught the demon. He's a piece of shit. He's a con artist. Yes. And yet, to your point, we still need this bridge to the non-Western mechanistic world. We need a bridge to the supernatural, quite frankly. We've lost our shamans. So the only person that he could go to who would have possibly gotten him out of this would be a mystic or a shaman who couldn't live amongst people. He'd have to live off in the hills somewhere. And it's a terrible shame that we've lost that connection. Yeah, I agree with you.
Well, at the end, it's interesting, at the end of the Jens essay on the psychology of the uncanny, it's almost a throwaway comment, but he says children and so-called primitive people, if it doesn't matter if what they believe is true, it has its effect, which is basically what you've just said. And he's basically admitting, I wouldn't call it a placebo effect. It's back to my point about there are certain rituals. An ancient Roman or an ancient Greek knew that the theater or the ritual they were performing every day was a social construct. But they lived in a sophisticated enough society to realize it had very practical benefits. And in our hyper-rational times, we've lost the practical benefits by just dismissing all of this stuff as either superstition or literature is airy-fairy, non-scientific, therefore what psychological insight does it have?
You're making a what would you call it? McGill-Christian point, aren't you, here? We've lost the right brain. and we've become too rational. And he's a very high IQ, educated and rational man, and he seems to have dedicated his life, or the latter part of his life, to banging that drum. We're being too rational. We're being rational to the point of sickness. And it's interesting because I do think it's reaching a collapse, actually, because it's evident that it doesn't work. None of my followers, none, I've not found one, takes psychiatry seriously or psychotherapy seriously. I've never, ever, I swear, met a follower of mine who would be saying, my psychotherapist says, and therefore that's what I'm going to do. It's quite the opposite. They're very jaded. I mean, psychiatry, none of my followers go to psychiatrists. They're like, absolutely not. And when I say, look, you really should try a psychotherapist again, they're like, they roll their eyes like teenage kids. They're like, oh, sir, we hate doing that. But that's not their fault. That's because, yes, we have the DSM. Yes, we have all this published research. And what fucking good has it done us? It's not like psychotherapists are just banging out healthy humans hand over fist, and we're running out of crazy people. We're running out of sick people. It's not working. It doesn't work. I think Richard Bandler, one of the founders of NLP, in a seminar said something like, never has something not worked for so long and still gotten away with it and still had so much respect in society. And he was talking about modern psychotherapy.
Which always goes back to my point about because people don't read, because people don't engage with what the ancient Greeks and Romans would have taken for granted. There's a massive hole.
Yes.
And people wonder why. It's this constant, ironically, it's like Nathaniel in the story. It's this constant circularity. And it reminds me of a lot of, we both have a passing interest in political issues. You can't not these days. But it's the repetitive whenever you see discussions online. So I know if you want to talk in terms of woke, for example, woke has slightly died down. But there must have been 2 or 3, 4 years maybe of endless online discussions about woke. What is it? Why is it a bad thing? Fine, have that discussion. But it's the repetitive, cyclical, let's go round and around and around and basically never talk about anything different.
Yes.
But that's always it. And I can see it's almost like relaxing because you know what you're going to get. So you settle down and you'll pick a channel that is predisposed to your biases, and you'll hear the same repetitive. And that seems to give people some type of emotional outlet, but it's not ever going anywhere. It's not what they call in philosophy teleological. It doesn't have an end in sight. It's just a Nathaniel type circle.
It's masturbational. It's masturbational. That's why I've dropped it. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've nothing to do with politics. I'll still go on the Jolly Heretic because it's a laugh. But I don't see any solutions there. I did for a couple of years. I was like, okay, there needs to be some kind of pushback. There needs to be a political pushback. And now I just think, God, what infertile ground politics is for anything of use or value to grow in. It's nothing. It's dust. It's shadows and dust, Maximus. It's all just a dirty fake power play, and there's nothing else there. If you keep going, any movement, any group, any person, go down and down and down and down. And as Zizek would say, you keep looking into yourself. Eventually, you find shit. There's only shit. There's only shit to be found. There's nothing there. So I agree with you. It's circular. It's masturbatory. Does nothing.
And one of the interesting things is you've just mentioned looking inside yourself, but if you'll forgive me just a couple of minutes explaining the setup, the scenario. Immanuel Kant, who was writing when this, round about the time just prior to when Hoffmann wrote his story, he had a concept of his notion of the sublime. There was a guy called Longinus, 1st century. He wrote about the sublime in terms of oratory and rhetoric. So it was a sound thing. Then Edmund Burke in the 1700s, he had a concept of the sublime, and it was to do with objects could bring it out of you. And then Kant comes along, and Kant had this. There were 2 aspects to it: the dynamic sublime and the mathematical sublime. The dynamic sublime is if you found yourself in the middle of the sea in a tempest, the sheer power of nature. There's a force, that would make you
Mm.
feel incredibly insignificant. The
Mm.
mathematical sublime is what I've spoken with you before about. I think I mentioned I was at the North Ridge of the Grand Canyon and just felt immensely insignificant. And it was an overwhelmingly peaceful sensation. Your mind cannot deal with the sheer scale. So what your mind, rather than becoming completely overwhelmed, your mind turns it into, I've used the word teleological, but in Kant's terms, you realize, you see the Grand Canyon as almost some representation of pure reason that at some level you can't access. But you then realize, well, that's the thing I can't access, but it's almost like a way of living morally. You can orientate yourself to the thing you can't fully access, but you understand, for example, you're an insignificant part of the universe, striving to be better, for example, or striving to find your place. So that's the experience of the sublime. It's the idea that you're not in danger, but you somehow feel a slight scintilla of terror. It's not pure terror, because that would involve actual danger, but you feel you could be in danger, but you're not. So that's all a very long-winded way of, that's the concept of the sublime. And what arguably the uncanny is that's addressed in this story and by Freud and Jens is it's the antithesis of the sublime. It's not looking out in the external world and having a sensation on the back of it. It's experience something in the outside world that actually resonates with something deep inside you, but it's not a positive teleological moral experience.
Right.
It's a negative experience. So again, it's a long-winded way of saying, ultimately, as human beings in the world, this is existential philosophy 101, Heidegger 101. They're saying we're thrown into the world as finite beings in this immense universe. And you yourself as an individual both shape and are shaped by external reality. So by definition, a socially well-adjusted person, an emotionally well-regulated person, has a good sense of the internal and the external. But our society has this weird, the external has become the internal and vice versa. With social media is like this exoskeleton of emotionality, if that's not mixing physiological terms. It's the psyche projected. It's what should be inside us projected outwards, and then being introjected back into us as you consume it. It's a messed up thing if you think about it.
Well, that's what empties people. I think that's why there are so many empty people. We've discussed interiority, and that literature seems to be a gymnasium training schedule for building interiority. A lot of people don't have interiority, and they can't resist mass movements. They can't resist the herd because there's no resistance. There's no muscle inside of them to resist it. And yes, I do think people have been turned inside out. And I do think that they're essentially eviscerated.
And
And
that's
they're
what
not really alive.
to bring it back to this concept of the uncanny. That's remember, the uncanny in German is unheimlich, unhomely. Heimlich is the home. And at the beginning of Freud's essay, he actually does a etymological, it's really involved. He looks at all the origins and roots of the word, and also says that homes, people don't think about this, but homes have a connotation of secrecy. What goes on in the home stays in the home. So there's an internal element to the uncanny that I think's all the way through this story. His trauma happened in the home, and his psychological problems are interior. And there's a couple of phrases. One of them was like charity, the uncanny begins at home, which I think is a great phrase. What was the other one? There's no place like home, and there's also no other place.
Yeah.
It's this, you can't escape your home, literally and metaphorically. Your family, your past goes with you like your shadow. And that's what the story partly is about. But the story at so many levels examines interiority. It examines cyclical, libidinal, endless circles. So this notion of the fiery circle must get mentioned countless times in that story.
Yeah.
And at the end, that's what he talks about, the fiery circle. And there's a
Mm.
character, he does this bizarre, Hoffmann does this bizarre story called, I think it's The Life and Opinions of Tomcat Moore, Murr. And it's like a weird postmodernist novel 200 years ahead of its time. But there's a guy in that called Kreisler, and Kreise in German is circle.
Mm.
And again, it's about this repetitive, his mind goes round in fragmented circularity.
Mm.
And I think that's what Hoffmann as an author in various stories, it's what makes him so Freudian or Jungian, but he's so psychoanalytical ahead of his time because he realizes deep within us, in the home of our ego, there are these tendencies. And to go back to what you were saying about Clara, she's right and she's not right, because what she represents in terms of these wider historical trends is, let's never really address what's going on. It's all a figment of your imagination. Deal with it, shut up, move on. Whereas primitive people and children realize, no, you can imagine something moves and it doesn't. You can imagine your toy. You can talk to your toy. But don't you find it interesting? It's like children don't have any problem believing a doll can be alive. But when we as adults see a doll like Chucky come alive, it scares the bejesus out of it. Talk about uncanny. As adults,
Yes.
we do not like that.
No. No, that's the uncanny valley effect, isn't it? So presumably
Yeah.
the child is superimposing a fantasy in which the doll is maybe like them, or a human, something lovable, and they're not in that dip in the valley where it's corpse-like or like a human, but just unhuman enough to make you go, ugh.
But
So
in
you either
terms
have
of,
to be totally non-human looking or very, very human looking, and everything inside the valley freaks us out.
but in terms of narcissism, yes, you could argue that maybe children, and I think this is what Jens tries to argue, that primitive peoples who believe in totems and so on, it's narcissistic to the extent they're projecting themselves out onto the external world. But I'd argue they're doing it transparently. It may be superstitious from an enlightened Western mind, but what they're not doing, and Freud actually admits this, he said, compared to primitive people, modern man has no greater sense or knowledge of death. We're no more sophisticated in the way we think of death.
Yes.
And you could argue that primitive people and children, they do this animistic thing. They see life forces in inanimate objects almost as a safety mechanism. They're doubling themselves. It makes them feel more alive. But
Yes.
interestingly, adults tend to see specters as doubles. They see doubles in the form of ghosts or reminders of ourselves as shadow forms. And they tend to be not additions to ourselves to make us feel more alive. They tend to be premonitions of death. So there's loads of adult stories about The Student of Prague is one, when you see death meet you on the road, and these type of stories. And that means that as adults, it's Freud's point, we are no better at thinking about death. At least children and primitives have a way of doing something with those emotions.
Yeah.
We allow them to become phantoms of ourselves, I think, as Clara says. But to just identify that we've got phantoms of ourselves and then go through life propagating it, never dealing with it, and repressing it isn't an answer either.
No, and I have wondered over the years if some of what we would call crazy behavior wouldn't end up making people psychologically healthier. So, you mentioned magic and imbuing power to things that don't have power, which is the very notion of a fetish, is that you instill libidinous energy into an inanimate object and say, this is Jesus Christ's finger bone, or this is the shin of my ancestor, and if I point it at you, you blah, blah, blah. I do wonder if we wouldn't be better off if you felt the presence of your dead grandmother, if you didn't just start talking to her, even if you're in the supermarket buying milk, and if that just became the societal norm, that people are just talking to themselves openly, and there's no prescribed religion. If your favorite thing to do today to connect with the sublime, as you mentioned earlier, is to go and hug a tree or lie under a tree or spend all day there or whatever it is, insane behavior might actually yield more psychological health. If people were weirder, if they were odder, if they were more open, because they're all internally odd. We're all internally odd, but that's just repressed oddness.
Yeah, but the fact is, it's a very small issue. The fact you use trees as an example of oddness. I'm lucky enough to live in a place where there are just endless trees. Like on my own plot of land, I think we have about 18 trees. And all the studies are, if you live in a green environment, it's psychologically incredibly beneficial, not just about air purity, but just feeling grounded. Having, it's a very tired analogy, but roots. You're surrounded by entities that have deep roots. And that is an atavistic requirement of, I would argue, a healthy psyche.
Okay, but that's, in evolutionary terms, that's home. That's Heimlich. That's Heimlich, because that's how we evolved, would have been
that's
in
Heimat.
greenery.
I'm not a German
Heimat.
expert, but yeah, Heimat is like homeland or home.
Homely.
Whereas, yeah, Heimlich is... It's this weird. I think in Freud's essay he points out the name that the word itself contains a sense of its antonym, its opposite.
Oh, I thought uncanny was unheimlich.
This is it is, but what Freud argues is the word Heimlich on its own immediately connotes a sense of the unheimlich.
Oh, okay.
And that's what makes it. Because Freud says, I'm now going to define it. And what they say, Freud's essay is uncanny itself, because he actually fails to define it particularly well. And it's uncanny that he doesn't realize how he's failed.
Yes.
His essay, for such a bright man, his essay about the uncanny is uncannily crass.
and reductionist. Not that Freud's ever guilty of that. Sometimes if I want to experience what you described as the mathematical sublime, I go and watch videos about astrophysics, or I look up facts about how many stars are in our galaxy and how many galaxies there are and how many potentially habitable planets there are, and what are the distances. And I find all of that terrifying, but I find it really enjoyable. It's like people who like watching horror movies, and then it reminds, it's so alien, it's so awful. Like the vastness of space and the number of stars that are out there. It's fucking horrifying. It's horror inducing. Then I just think, oh, but I'm not there. And then I can come home and I enjoy my home. I enjoy Earth. I think any billionaire or anybody who fantasizes about leaving Earth is a delusional psychotic. This is the best place to possibly be. So you can, through the uncanny, I suppose, you can even induce an appreciation for its opposite, for home.
And this is the complex relationship between the uncanny and the sublime. And ironically, my equivalent to what you're doing is, given that he was the one who wrote about the sublime, if you ever try and tackle Kant's critique of pure reason or practical reason or the critique of judgment, it is like a highly polished skyscraper-sized diamond of logical depth. And if you're honest, intellectually honest with yourself, I'm trying to think of an equivalent whereby, if you went to the gym, it's basically like running 3 Ironman races in a row and managing to do it. But it's the absolute, if you let yourself be intimidated by it, it would drive you, you just whimper and run away. But the point is, it's allowing yourself to appreciate the immensity. And from that, it's what you're talking about, working out a way to receive sustenance from that, rather than seeing it as a threat. And I think what we've discussed, this complete lack of reading, or people don't want to engage with difficult stuff because there's some mechanism whereby they've lost a relationship to the sublime. I think they can still find it in nature, but intellectually, I get it also from maths. I am not gifted at maths, but I've always been fascinated by the complexity and the beauty of the mathematical ideas. And again, but most people's response is, I'm not particularly good at that, I'm not going to do it. Or anyone who tries to push me to do it is being arsey, leave me alone, leave me alone. And I just think, maybe I'm being naive, so many of our problems, I think, would at least be mitigated if, rather than, it goes back to this relationship between the internal and the external. What I'm trying to say very clumsily is, what the examples you and I have given are both related to us as individuals, our internal psyches, trying to engage with an external source, and then somehow tracing the feedback loops and being aware of the feedback loops. So we're tied to our environment's tied to us. The social media type environment breaks that link, or makes it pathologically disorientating. Hence, Kelsoprees, mental illness everywhere.
Yes, definitely. There is a literary solution to people who are phobic of maths. You'll be happy to know. I found it by reading the science fiction trilogy called The Three Body Problem, and it's not a story about maths, but it gives you appreciation of mathematics as a pure universal language, that if you were to try and communicate with an alien species of presuming intelligence, you'd start with maths. You'd start there because it's the most primal symbol system we have. There is one of one thing and there is two of two things. And before I read that book, I was like, fuck maths. I don't care about maths. Why is people so stuck on maths? But you read those books, it's a really, really good trilogy. And I walked away with a lot more respect for maths, physics, and engineering as essential subjects. And it does it in a very psychologically literate way. It's a recommendation for anybody who wants to give it a go. And it will fill you with terror and awe at the scale of the universe as well, which is good fun.
And just one more idea I had before, because it was an image in my head. One of the definitions of the uncanny, I think, comes from Freud, where he talks about it's a return of what was once familiar. And he gives this beautiful image. I think some people benefit from having images. It's like walking across a dry pond and at any moment expecting the water to seep up.
That's good.
And I think that's a beautiful way of expressing what the uncanny is. It's something that isn't really there yet, is, in a weird way.
Yeah.
I just thought that was one of the things that I understood most about the whole concept of the uncanny. And the Kingsnorth book about Against the Machine, he has a phrase where he's talking about all the things he's trying to explain about what is machinic about our world. And he says, he doesn't say it in quite these terms, but he does use the phrase I'm about to use. He goes on and on about how it seems alien, it seems inhuman, we have no control over it. And he goes, I can say it in so many ways, but you just know something isn't right.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like to live in modernity. You just feel that something isn't right.
Yes, you know that this isn't right. You know it. You feel it.
And that again is an element of the uncanny.
Yes, that's interesting. I wrote it off as just a general sense of alienation, feeling alienated from other people, seeing people alienated from each other, seeing the splintering and the division politically and within family units and groups that goes on. But yes, I hadn't thought of it as being it is a part of the uncanny as well.
Well, it's not a bad analogy if you think of modernity as the dry pond. And the uncanny, to the extent we now experience it, is little senses that how things used to be and how they could have been, or how they could be better. There's little hints.
Yes.
There's still people have real conversations. There are people who meet in reality and have dinner. There are these little families still matter.
Yes.
It's an ever descending slope where these things become rarer and rarer and rarer.
True. Very true. Yeah, no, I'm actually much more hopeful these days than I've been before, because did you know social media usage across the board is down 10% now?
All right.
10%. People are getting sick of it. They're getting absolutely fucking sick of it.
We're doing our bit to drive the numbers down.
Absolutely. Get off the internet, go and read a book and hang out with your mates. Don't watch us.
Well, have you got any more to say? I think I've taught myself to a stop.
No, I think I've gotten it all out in a true German Reichian sense. I've given it all out.
Well,
And
that's
now
not a very nice image. I'm basically your Reiki and orgasmatron.
No, not you, darling. The audience. You're the doctor who's having me sit on the saddle with my petticoats lifted.
Oh God, I was hoping we'd get through without any disturbing images. But just so people know, in a month's time, we're going to do the Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
And then you and I'll talk off camera about maybe what else. I don't have to keep foisting things on you, but I have ideas for. I'd quite like to do, and this isn't an innuendo. I'd quite like to do Moby Dick.
I've never read it, so.
Well, again, I think it's got a lot of psychological insight that about again this obsessive. If you want to keep on the obsessive theme, obsessively, but Ahab's unifocal mania. The great white whale, you can make of it. Most people in their life have a great white whale they're trying to kill. I have whole pods of them.
And I kill them all. Yes, I think that's a good suggestion. I think we should do that for sure.
Right. Well, thank you so much, and to everyone on Richard's channel and my channel. Till the next time, all the very best. Take care.
Cheers, folks.